From an eastbound commuter train, Toronto comes at you in pieces. Your first glimpse of the city itself is of the high-rise cluster at Yonge and Bloor. Only moments later does the downtown core come into view. The form of the city provokes questions. Why did we build it this way? What kind of plan were we following? And what sort of city are we building now?
We'd be lucky if we were like a Paris. Perhaps there'll be parts of Toronto that will become like Paris, but in fact, Toronto hasn't grown in the way that Housemans Paris has grown, where he knocked down a lot of significant parts of the city. And the result of Paris is a very consistent, uniform, mid-rise city with beautiful tree-lined avenues and wide boulevards. So when you return from Paris and you come back to Toronto, you realize that Toronto is nothing like that. And despite the fact that we have a really excellent official plan that recognizes the form and shape of our centers, our downtown, our waterfront, and where its neighborhoods are, and how our avenues work to serve the neighborhoods as walkable, retail-lined streets, Toronto hasn't really grown that way. And one of the things that strikes you when you come back from other cities is that Toronto is really quite fragmented in the way it's grown. And despite the best efforts of the city to create planning regimes and documents and guidelines to guide that growth, we're just finding time and time again the reality on the ground is not what we expect to happen.
Well, I think Toronto, through the 20th century, may have actually lived through three different paradigms. The first one was sort of a non-planning paradigm. The city up until the 1930s and 40s was guided by municipal ordinances of one kind or another, but there was no real plan set aside that really guided the city's development. This didn't happen until sometime in the Second World War and a few years after. So there's two paradigms that ended up being the subject of my study in my book on the history of Toronto planning. One that ran from the Second World War until sometime in the 1960s or maybe the early 70s. And then another paradigm that emerged by about 1980 and is, as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not sure everybody would agree with me, is still with us.
And I would say that we have in the city of Toronto today operating a couple of different philosophies, more or less understood as such. You know, we have a philosophy of planning that's really focused on essentially a kind of form-based planning that tries to be relatively predictable about what the future form of the city might be. And that's mostly found in the official planning culture in the city here. I think at the same time we're actually operating and building the city as underneath a philosophy which is more like something like radical incrementalism, which is what we really see, you know, if we look around in what I would call the tower archipelago that we're building in the center of the city now, where we have a form of development that's responding very specifically to a series of, you know, demographic and economic imperatives, and producing a form of building that is really unanticipated by almost all of the planning documents that we have in kind of official planning culture. So we're building a city that's quite a bit different than the one that we are trying to predict through our form-based code approach that we see officially.
I think in Toronto it's easy to talk about planning philosophies past and present because they're apparent in the city that you see. The pre-war fabric, which was the kind of the streetcar suburbs, is what we call now downtown. And that's the embodiment of that past planning philosophy. When we go to the post-war city, obviously you see the arterials, you see the suburbs, the car-oriented suburbs, and so it's a really strong physical manifestation of that shift in a planning philosophy. And so it's clear to see how the city evolved with those changing philosophies. If you look at the regional philosophy, Toronto was always the economic engine of the region. And so how we designed transit, how we thought about growth, how we thought about jobs, really reflected the philosophy that Toronto is the center. And people live somewhere else and they come and they work in Toronto.
Toronto's a great city, but it self-organized itself. It wasn't like a huge grand plan. It wasn't Chicago or Burnham's idea of Chicago. It grew incrementally by suburb, adding up. And surprisingly enough, there were some really nice things about that, neighborhoods and streets. And, you know, we pat ourselves on the shoulder because of that, but it wasn't, you know, as a result of clear planning. It was good luck.
You know, you look at the park lots that kind of determined how, really, in the beginning, it was basically an act of accounting. It's like a hand sketch with Simcoe giving these long, narrow lots to, you know, his buddies, basically, and said, here, make a town, you know, and that's what we have. And amazingly, it's, I call it sort of, I mean, that wasn't Victorian times, but as the city evolved in the Victorian era, it was a sort of a template stamped on the city, which is fine. It's worked out all right, and it's kind of interesting, but at the same time, it's been able to absorb things so that a much more sophisticated idea of public space comes in the 50s and 60s when we have a wave of immigration, people from Europe who understand what public space is actually about.
Thank God for that.
Yeah, the Victorian template was like, you know, you should stay in your backyard, or, you know, if you're in a park, it means you don't have a decent backyard, you know, and it was always suspicious.
I think there is a tendency to see the modernists as concerned with efficiency, which is true to a degree, but it was not an overwhelming thing. The planners wanted a beautiful city that served everybody well. This was also, I should mention this too, the equity here. The planning was guided by a desire to make life better for everybody. And so when they proposed parkland, for instance, they wanted the parkland to be accessible by people without cars. So it was essential that the buses be able to go into, and it would be a bus stop. And to this day, there's a TTC stop beside or even on the sort of the edge of a lot of major parks in the metropolitan area.
I think if you're in a responsible situation where you're a planner, you're thinking about the city, you really have to have some serious ideas about places like cities. You have to have a theory, a sense of how cities evolve, change, permanency. These are kind of long-term issues that you have to really know something about.
I think there's a real move, I mean, I think it's general, not just in planning, but throughout society, where the actually, you know, the elitist version of someone who actually knows what they're talking about, someone who has a background and has done research and can talk about all those different things. I think somehow that has become secondary, so that the whole notion of you know, ground up public consultation, which, you know, became important in the it was always important, but it came into being in the 1970s, has somehow, you know, the pendulum has swung so that everything is about being an empty vessel and not imposing ideas on people.
The reform movement came to be in Toronto in the late 60s, and David Crombie was elected mayor in 1972, and a number of new bylaws were passed and new planning processes were put in place so that people would be consulted and would decide the fate of their own areas. The principle was that the people who lived there should make decisions on what was best for their neighborhood. And that is really the central foundation of the new paradigm that has become normal since about 1980 or so in Toronto.
So I would say that the metaphor that I think we're operating with, and the one that I'm kind of most interested in trying to explore, is the city as a kind of open source kind of process. It's very interesting to be inside that process. If you're on the outside of it, looking for, again, for this kind of predictability that seemed to be the basis of the sort of pre-amalgamation thinking about the city, this looks like chaos. And, you know, there is a chaotic dimension to it. But I think it's also a very interesting process because it means now we're making a city that we haven't lived in before. And we're having to really think hard about what life in this new city we're building is going to be. And it's not something we're thinking about in advance. We're actually thinking about it as we're doing it.
There was a term used by John Van Nostrand once, and it was called unplanning. And it's an interesting thought. I don't think it's entirely where we want to go, because I think that we can shape the city in intentional ways, but it does suggest that we do need to step back and really recognize that a lot of what is actually happening is unplanned.
Taking, and I hate this phrase, but the low-hanging fruit. Well, let's talk about streetscape, let's talk about street trees. Let's not talk about the connection between urban and suburban areas. Let's put $25 million under the gardener, but let's not talk about Rexdale, let's not talk about Scarborough. I mean, I think those are the real issues out there for the city today, and I think that's where it has huge ramifications politically. So you have a whole divide between the original city of Toronto and all the other boroughs and towns that were amalgamated with this. I mean, I think it's never really been fully embraced and those real issues taken on.
I think looking at the region, it is harder. There's a lot of local municipal politics that people get caught up in, and those issues are real. But it is important to also keep an eye on the bigger picture and the greater lens in terms of the economy of the region. It's not just about the individual buildings and designs and densities and so on. In order to grow the economy of our whole region, we have to have access to jobs and homes and an economy, not just in the center of Toronto, but in all our multiple satellite centers.
Thinking about what goes on in the center has implications for the rest of the place, our own periphery and beyond. So I think questions around mobility within the region are really crucial, and Toronto being the center of those networks for the most part, except for maybe the airports, means that we have to be integrated in the way that we plan around those things and the way in which we make those kinds of connections.
One of the things I noticed is that when localism arose, which is to say that a neighborhood will solve its own problems, that lessened the idea that problems are metropolitan-wide. So metropolitan planning just sort of became an imposition on the neighborhood rather than a logical solution to a problem. And in the new paradigm, it seems to me that metropolitan solutions are not available because, I mean, how could you get a local council to want to use its area for the new power plant? Who wants the new power plant in their neighborhood? But if the metropolitan area needs a new power plant, it has to go somewhere. But without a metropolitan authority to say where it's going to go, I don't think it will ever be built.
You need to have the big idea, you need to hang on to it, and you have to be sensitive about how it impacts the local scale. So the scales are all very connected. You can't do one without the other. But I think it's important to keep your eye on three scales at the same time if you can. Sort of the global scale, how can we compete with other big cities in the world? How we can make sure we're healthy as a region in terms of our economy and jobs, and how we're being sensitive to our neighbors as we implement this. I think there are a couple of tools that I always bring to mind. First of all, it's just the language we use about the story. We're not talking about today's city, really, when we're talking about planning. We have to be mindful of that. We have to be respectful of today's city, but we're really talking about tomorrow's citizens. And so the role of the planning is to represent tomorrow's citizens and give them a voice in these decisions.
Because we can't anticipate immediately what a city will be like, it's not just about allowing a city to grow organically, and whatever we end up in the long term is what we get because it just happened. We have to think about how we grow the city in a framework that is right-sized. And what I mean by right-sized is what we perceive as people living in a building, walking down a street, and what makes us feel comfortable.
As a kid, I used to sort of draw these kind of fantastic cities. I drew cartoons and things like that. And I remember, I think I might have even said this in my interview at the University of Waterloo, where I eventually went to school to study architecture, that I didn't think I could ever design anything smaller than a city. So I would say that, I kind of had a trajectory there of thinking that it's all about something that I or somebody else could design And now I think it's more about trying to figure out how you marshal a whole bunch of sometimes conflicting trajectories into something that actually produces a good project in the end.
People are now looking for different models for how to live in the city, which is really an issue. Planning should be about how can we live together in the city in a way, you know, that's not creating tensions or fighting. If you ask me for a definition, that's what I would sort of say. How to live, you know, intelligently, how to live socially in a city. How do we try to find a way of doing that?